The endocrine system is the organ system inside of the body that is responsible for secreting and releasing hormones that will elicit a response on some sort of target cell. So we might remember that hormones are signaling molecules that are created by one tissue that have an impact on a different tissue. So one tissue is going to make and release a hormone, which will then be picked up by the bloodstream and carried off to a different tissue where it is going to have an impact. Now, these hormones typically don't just release on their own. They need to have some sort of stimulus that causes their creation and release. And there are three stimuli that we talk about when we talk about the release of hormones. There is the humoral stimulus, which this is changing levels of ions or nutrients. So an example of this would be low calcium levels being detected by the body, stimulating the release of parathyroid hormone, which will in turn raise calcium levels. Okay. The second type of stimulus is the neural stimulus, and this is created by nerve fibers. So nerve fibers will basically release a neurotransmitter that can then stimulate the release of a hormone. So neurons of the sympathetic nervous system can cause the release of catecholamines from the adrenal gland. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then the third type of stimulus is hormonal stimulus. Okay? And so this is when a hormone triggers release of another hormone. So an example of this would be growth hormone is being released as a result of growth hormone releasing hormone. And that is pretty common, especially in the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which we will talk about a little bit later on. Okay, so there are three different ways at which this hormone can be triggered to be released, right? So then once the hormone is released, it is going to go off into the bloodstream, and then it's going to be transported to another tissue where it will have an impact. Okay, now once it gets to that tissue, remember that there has to be an interaction, right, between the hormone and a receptor, right? So each hormone is going to have its own specific receptor, and based off of what type of signaling molecule, right, what type of macromolecule that hormone is, will dictate where that receptor might be, right? So like steroid hormones can cross through the cell membrane and have receptors on the inside of the cell, whereas your peptide hormones have to have a receptor on the cell surface, on the cell membrane. Okay, so, but it is that the specific interaction between the hormone and the receptor that will generate the overall response from the cell itself. Now, we can have a change in the number of receptors, which can change the overall response of the cell, right? So we can make more receptors. So if we make more receptors, what do you think is going to be the result of that hormone receptor interaction? More hormones combine to receptors, right? And so you're going to get sort of a bigger response out of that. So that's what we would call upregulation, right? In turn, or opposite of that, we could have a decrease in the receptors. And if we decrease the number of receptors, right, that is going to decrease the overall response. So increase the receptors is upregulation, decrease of the receptors is downregulation, right? The other thing that we can do is our body can sort of change the sensitivity of the receptors to the hormones by doing things like changing affinity, right? And so with that, we can also have sort of slight changes in the receptor, which can lead to upregulation and downregulation, right? But it's all about that interaction between the hormone and the receptor. Now, if that hormone is no longer needed, right, it will be broken down by the body and it will be metabolized or excreted from the body, right? So it can be metabolized by the liver, it can be excreted by the kidneys, right? But in any way, shape, or form, it has to be cleared from the bloodstream. So if that hormone's around and in the bloodstream, it has the capacity to interact with that receptor. So when we talk about clearance or getting rid of a given hormone, we often talk about its half-life. And so the half-life of a hormone is basically the amount of time needed for the body to decrease the concentration by half, right? And so there are a couple of different things inside of the body that can change the overall half-life of the hormone, and that's usually a response to some sort of other hormonal stimulus or response, right? But under general circumstances, right, the half-life typically remains constant or steady. Okay? So the half-life is typically remains constant. I'm just going to underline typically because, again, there are some other things that can change the overall clearance rate or the half-life of a given organ or hormone, right? That can be things like pregnancy. So if the half-life, right, remains constant, what do you think then is going to dictate the lifespan of the effect of a given hormone? So we can't change how quickly our body gets rid of it. What we can change is our production and release rate, right? So hormonal concentrations then are dictated by that production and release rate. Or in other words, the production and release rate dictate hormonal levels. Okay? And again, that's because the half-life typically remains stable. So as we sort of look into the endocrine system, we're going to break this down into individual organs, and then we're going to break it down into individual hormones, and all of these hormones are going to have specific pathways that they use at the cellular level, right? So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is what we talked about in the cellular communication chapters, is that there are different signal transduction pathways, but there are three main pathways that we talk about, right? So if you don't remember those three pathways, go back, take a look at those pathways, and think about which pathway is used under certain circumstances. Which pathway is used for protein synthesis, which pathway is used for muscle contraction, and which pathway is used for stimulating mitosis or growth. Okay? If you can get those three down, we can think about the effect of the hormone and really pin it to one of those three signal transduction pathways, usually. Not always, but usually.